welcome. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Conchúr of Giollagáin from the UHI Languages Institute, who is one of the leading researchers in Gaelic sociolinguistics and revitalization, who's been talking to us today on the topic of living off the edge, the crisis in late modern ethno-linguistic diversity from the Gaelic perspective, which builds on a major research project that Conchúr has undertaken. And also more on this can be found in his recent publication, The Gaelic Crisis in the Vernacular Community, as you'll see on the slide. So we're very excited about this, to hear more about your research on this very important topic. Over to you, Conchúr.
Okay. Thank you, Raggy. Agus thank you for some fast and kind of shin. Agus file to another seminar show. Just to thank Raggy for those kind words and to welcome everybody to the seminar today. I hope to speak around 35 to 40 minutes, leave plenty of time for questions in the chat afterwards. And as Raggy is saying, I'm going to talk in general about our new publication, The Gaelic Crisis in the Vernacular Community. And this is the structure of the talk. I give some background analysis where we started from, basically. And you'll forgive me if I move a pace through the statistical data in the book. That's available in a web linking we have and in the research digest. So I'm not going to dwell too much on that. I really want to concentrate on what I would call the impediments to progress and a more progressive way that we can deal with Gaelic policy in Scotland mainly, but also I refer to Ireland. If you permit me then, I'd like to start with a few historical points. You probably all know this, but it's no point just setting it out again. The historical trajectory of the Gaelic speaker group. And as we know, the Gaelic group in Scotland has a longer history of an asymmetrical power dynamic with the English or Scots group than in Ireland. The Scottish Gaelic group has been in contraction in Scotland since the 13th century, while the Gaelic group in Ireland maintained its political and societal integrity until the 17th century. But now the Gaelic group, even in the Gaelic Highlands, that has been in contraction since the 18th century, and as I said, in Ireland since the 16th century. I'll also start with an interesting ethno-linguistic observation in Hiram Morgan's history of the subjugation of the O'Neill lordship and his, as we know, he had a coalition of Gaelic dynasts that was defeated in 1601. But prior to that, there was an ongoing degradation of the status and social system of Gaelic Ireland, which preceded the political and military defeat. So essentially, from the 16th, 17th century, the Gaelic group has been contraindicated with social mobility. That means that, on the other hand, then, English or Scots has been associated with societal modernization, state-building processes, socioeconomic and political advantage, and then all the cultural capital that goes with civic elaboration. So in one sense, this is where the challenge is, that the Gaelic world has jumped from early modern power politics to postmodern civic symbolic promotion with relatively little experience of the politics and cultural capital of modernity. So there's a big gap there that most robust cultures go through to achieve modernity. And I'll come back to that issue of modernity and social status later on. Again, some of you may be aware that preceding our own study of the social geography of Gaelic in Scotland, similar research had been done in Ireland, published in and in 2007, an update in 2015, the comprehensive linguistic study of the use of Irish in the Irish Gaeltacht. And the dark blue on this map of Ireland indicates the areas with the higher social density of Irish speaking in the Irish Gaeltacht. And that's a copy there of the update research. So coming now to Scotland, having done a comprehensive in-depth study of the social geography of Irish, we wanted to do something similar in Scotland. And the aim of our research project was to do an in-depth focus on the use and transmission of Scottish Gaelic as a communal language in the Western Isles, Staffin in the Isle of Skye, and the Isle of Tyree. In other words, the remaining vernacular geography of Gaelic in Scotland. If I can move on then to, and I'm going to move at pace as I said, the dimensions of the crisis. But before I start also, with minority language planning, what we're trying to do essentially is to reverse a detrimental legacy. But on the at the outset of this, you'd say that there is a favourable basis for Gaelic policy and social supports because of the following factors: the folk memory of and the scholarship on Gaelic as a multi-domained, cross-societal, having cross-societal status in early modern feudal and dynastic period. Again, this is referring back to the 17th and 18th century. There is contemporary promotion for the minority language, and this gets aspirational support at the political level. There's institutional provision entailing strategic and financial resources, and then there is a level of public sympathy which goes in hand with some of the postmodern tolerance for diversity. A lot of the policy is quite symbolic, and as we know, it's easier to accept the symbolism of diversity rather than accept or deal with the social reality of the erosion of the actual speaker. On top of that also, we have learning of Gaelic and Irish schools, and we have quite well-developed scholarly activities on both languages. So, moving on then. So, well, what is the problem? And there's a common problem between the way Irish and Gaelic in Scotland are promoted. But we essentially have language promotion without language protection, and the current type of language promotion we have assumes that the societal group is stronger than it actually is, and the language promotion is in a very weak or anemic, as I say here, societal engagement with the actuality of the speakers. Put in another way, the existing policy only interacts in an ineffectual way with the actual societal decline that the Gaelic groups have experienced. This is the conflict between aspiration over social reality, and the aspiration is operationalized mainly through symbolic engagement. Okay, to start then, looking at some of the data from the book, and as I say, I'm not going to deal with it comprehensively here. It's available in our digest on our website and in the publication, of course. But the main point, following the multimodal surveys we conducted as part of this project, we are contending that the remaining Gaelic vernacular communities in Scotland are at the point of societal collapse. In other words, they've lost the capacity to transmit their culture from one generation to the next. We can see this statistically in our analysis of the census data. It's quite clear that there was a major contraction in the social density of Gaelic speakers from 1981 onwards. And as I said earlier, the community now has lost the capacity to regenerate itself. And this concurs with the generally accepted sociological definition of language loss, which I know is contested because there is an ideological definition of language loss that contends something to the differ. But the aim of this book was to engage in logical analysis of the Gaelic reality rather than engage in ideological debate. One of the main statistical findings of the book is what we call, and this was referred to earlier by Ken McKinnon, but we were able to put a figure on it, that the actuality gap of what is reported in the census and what actually exists in communities is a gap of 30 percentage points. And I'll explain how we came up with that. But first of all, we divided up the Western Isles, Staffin and the Isle of Kerry into 25 study districts. And these are independent curves of all these districts, 25 of them, and the decline you can see as the line gets darker. That brings it to the contemporaries, the last census, 2011. And you can see, on average, an over 10% reduction in every census reporting period. If we compare the data for our study area, the 25 study areas, mainly based in the Western Isles, with the data for Scotland, you'll see this on the right-hand side of the screen there. The less than 1% of households in Scotland where all adults and all children use Gaelic. And the current symbolic civic promotion of Gaelic is trying to increase those numbers while at the same time more or less being dissociated from the actual reality of the communities where it has a higher density, and that is now what is in danger of disappearing. Okay. I'm moving on here now to our Nexus analysis, and this is how we came up with our 30 percentage point actuality gap. And we did this by doing a statistical correlation of family household Gaelic use on the vertical axis with the Gaelic ability use in the Gaelic ability data in the census for all the 25 study districts. And then we did a cluster analysis for the stats for every single district. And the cluster analysis identified 3 groups. And I'll move on again, and you'll see the top group, as we refer to the residual bilingual group. All these areas now are English language dominant, therefore even the stronger areas, the Gaelic exists as a residual aspect of these communities. Moving on then, you can see the groups in the interstitial group, and then below that again, when an area drops below 15% of families using at home and 45% of individuals in the area having Gaelic, we refer to that as the moribund nexus. In other words, there's so much variability and variance in that data that the use of Gaelic in these communities is close to a moribund state for language, way below the residual comparative state in the other areas in the survey. Okay, to show the geography of it then, another way of indicating the crisis and the decline over this 30-year period from 1981 to 2011. If we look at the data for Gaelic ability for those 3 to 17, nearly all of the study districts in our research area, they pertain to the 75 plus, 90% plus, the top 2 ranges. Moving forward then, the map on the right-hand side, the same 3 to 17-year-old Gaelic ability data for 2011, and nearly all the districts pertain to the 2 lower ranges, less than 60% and less than 45%. And as we've pointed out, that this 45% cutoff is very, very critical. Another way of looking at it is if you compare the demo-linguistic decline of Gaelic speakers in the 50 plus age group, and you compare that on the right-hand side then, the decline for the 3 to 17, and you can see the level of decline in the youth cohort is more precipitous. and it indicates there that the cohort of young speakers 3 to 17 is now below 2,000 people, or all of the Western Isles, Staffin and Paddy. Okay, if we move on then to another chapter, and I'm not going to dwell on these, I'll just give you the headline data on this. We did a survey of all the preschools, and we got a very high take-up of this, very good response rate. We asked the preschool teachers and managers to fill out a survey about the preschoolers, the attendees in their centres, and the main finding of this is that only 4% of the responses for the preschoolers indicate that they either had a fluent native speaker level of spoken Gaelic or understanding Gaelic on their own. So that's a fairly good indication of the amount of familial transmission of Gaelic in these communities. If we move on then to a very, very detailed teenager survey, chapter 4 of the Gaelic Crisis book, and this combined multi-modular questionnaire plus focus groups where we discussed in detail with the teenagers their experience and aspirations and identity issues around Gaelic. The main finding from this survey is that the use of Gaelic among teenagers is even lower than what has been reported in the census. And whilst 20% of the teenagers report a fluency in Gaelic, that both entails the native speakers and the learners, we discovered that only around 5 to 6% speak Gaelic with parents, in the home in other words, but more worryingly and more troublesome, a little over 1% of the teenagers report that they always or mainly speak Gaelic to their friends. And you can see it there when we ask them to indication of the home practice of Gaelic, and you can see the dominance of always English for the teenage cohort. Okay, if we can move on then to the main points on top of the data that I want to raise today, and we have to acknowledge that there is an ideological tension that arises from the nature of Gaelic policy that we have in Ireland and Scotland, simply because the actuality of the societal presence is much weaker than is what is assumed in the policy. Some of this difficulty comes from having provision for learners of Irish and Gaelic in a way that is independent of the issues of sustaining the actual speaker communities. Again, it is this tension between symbolic provision and dealing with actual communities. Based on the data in this survey and work done by Ken McKinnon, and I'm thinking also of the Shiabus report conducted by Gillian Monroe and her team, it's quite clear now that the status quo and sustaining native speaking communities in Scotland and Ireland is now basically incompatible. We need to deal with this issue another way that deals with head-on with the issue of the contraction of the actual speaker group. We know also from going through the research process in Ireland, and the conclusions there were that we need a new educational system rooted in group cultural capital based in a model of minority language communal renewal. That's set out in the research paper et al. Published in 2014. And also, because of the emphasis on the symbolic strategy at the minute, we are calling for a social strategy to compensate for the lack of comprehensiveness in current policies. And if you want to go into these issues in more detail, you can read chapter 10 of this important publication from Ireland, the analysis of bilingual competence, and I don't have the time to talk about it in more detail. But that generally sets out a social strategy for a threatened minority language. Okay, if we can move on to an issue of diagnostics, and we talk about this in a lot of detail in the book, our own diagnostics, but it's useful also to dwell on what Louis-Jean Calvet, his publication from 2005, in how he depicts the postmodern linguistic reality. And he talks in terms of the position of language in comparison to other language. In other words, it's like a constellation of stars, a linguistic gravitational system. He talks about the mode of acquisition and the direction of acquisition. The system is your language a central language, a language with power, or a peripheral language? As we know now, most languages spoken in the world today are peripheral to centers of power. Is the acquisition spontaneous? In other words, through families, communities, ordinary communal interactions, or is it programmed? In other words, through schools? And then is the acquisition of the language, is it done as, again, where we have bilingualism, is it done in a vertical manner or a horizontal manner? Vertical acquisition means you learn a language of a higher or a lower status to your own. In most cases, people learn languages of equal or stronger status, and therefore we get a lot of horizontal bilingualism. You learn a language of a similar status to your own. In other words, French speakers learning German or French speakers learning English. Right. So armed with Jean-Louis Calvet's diagnostics, we can do a differential diagnostic of Scottish Gaelic. And in its ecological position, where is it in the constellation, the gravitational pull of it? And it's quite clearly, it's a peripheral indigenous language with a small vernacular group around 11,000. We think the vernacular group from the study in Ireland, the vernacular group in Ireland is around 18,000, and both of them are in an advanced stage of language shift, and they benefit from comparatively marginal institutional support. The mode of acquisition of these languages is becoming increasingly programmed. In other words, you learn it through school, not through community or family, and this means that the spontaneous capacity to acquire the language is dwindling. And then the direction of the acquisition for the vernacular speakers, the direction is compulsory vertical upward acquisition of English. And then for the learners, it's downward optional acquisition of a language which is becoming increasingly non-vernacular. Moving on then, if we have a diagnostic, then we can have a prognosis. And if we continue on this line of having civic promotion without vernacular protection, in terms of position, Gaelic will be a peripheral, non-vernacular secondary language. In other words, no native-speaking communities based on the current trajectory. The mode of acquisition will be programmed through schools only, and the direction of acquisition will be for English speakers to acquire it vertically. In other words, it's downward acquisition of a low status language. Okay, if we move on then, given this prognosis, given what we know of the societal contraction of the Gaelic communities in Ireland and Scotland, we should have a look at the policy framework then in a bit more detail, and we discuss this in the book also. And we discuss this issue of derivative thinking, that the model in Ireland and Scotland is borrowed from Wales, which in turn borrows heavily from Canadian language legislation. And the common denominator between all these three dispensations or policy provisions, the two common denominators are the civic promotion and sectoralism. And what I mean by sectoralism is that the policy mainly focuses on educational provision, broadcasting, the arts, academia, cultural interpretation, in other words, tourism, and it's weakly targeted on social supports or the societal salience, and weakly targeted on the issue of community development for the existing community of speakers. And this raises the question again, given what we know, why has this discourse got such an ease of passage? Relatively few people have challenged this discourse. But again, based on the evidence we have now, for this discourse of civic promotion without language protection to seem plausible, it requires these 5 factors. That the linguistic minority would be depoliticized in their own context. In other words, it appears to the outside world that the linguistic minority is acquiescing in their own demise, but in reality, what they're being offered is a no-choice scenario, a take-it-or-leave-it scenario. I'm borrowing here from the Zygmunt Bauman, the Polish sociologist, came up with this analysis of late modern democracy, which is based on the no-choice scenario. Also, part of the depoliticizing of the language group in crisis like this, for this to continue, what we've had to date is an unresponsive officialdom that hasn't been capable of showing social empathy for a group in crisis. This is one of the, again, a factor of the depoliticization. Also, there's the issue of I'm referring to Bonaventura Sousa Santos' work. He talks about autochthonous epistemicide, in other words, devaluing the cultural status, the cultural capital of the group that is society threatened. Again, for ease of passage of this symbolic promotion, it requires also what I refer to here as a deference to a clericalism in language scholarship, a concern for words rather than a concern for people and speakers. This is a syndrome identified in Ireland by the Irish critic Desmond Fennell in 1971. This is one of the mixed blessings of philological or Celtic studies. It's given us great scholarship, but it's given us this focus, words, texts, literary canons, relatively little focus on the Gaelic societies in Ireland and Scotland. Combined with this also, and I'm borrowing here from Glenn William, the Welsh sociologist, and he talks about the inadvertent reification of language. Language as a thing, language as a focus of, or an amalgamation of personal projects, rather than a language that is an emergent feature of a collective culture. On top of all this, of course, given the evidence we now have, for this ease of passage of the civic promotion discourse to continue, we more or less have to set aside the evidence, and I've referred to this previously as the demo-linguistic set aside. Leon O'Kernan, the Irish linguist, has also referred to this. He refers to this as the disregard of the social crisis of the speaker community in the sanctioned discourse we have in Ireland. Okay, so moving on then, and what I want to do now is I want to summarize the diagnostics of the minority language condition as it pertains to the learner discourses referred to here in the middle column as a post-autochthonous view and the autochthonous view, and we can see that these are competitively portrayed in many of the language discourses in contemporary minority sociolinguistics. And if we look on the left-hand side, you'll see the context, and we can compare how the learner discourse and the autochthonous discourse is portrayed. In historical trajectory, the learner discourse is utopian, while the autochthonous one is recessive. In social dynamic, the learner debate is, learners are considered networked, while in the autochthonous group it's fragile or disintegrating. The generational trend for the learners is focused on the young, while for the autochthonous group the focus is on the crisis. Therefore, there's more salience among the aging. It's anachronistic. In other words, the geographic approach emphasizes for the learners the metropolitan aspect, and for the autochthonous group, rural marginality. Ideologically, for the learners, legitimate, and for the attachments group, it is labelled, often accused as being essentialistic. The learner identity discourse is relativistic, basically, and for the attachments group, it's marked or subordinate. The institutional support for the learner group is targeted, mainly through schools. Institutional supports for the attachments minority is deconstructed. Leadership for the learners is institutional, and the leadership for the attachments group is either vacant or reticent. Political intervention for the learners is engaged but expedient, and for the attachments group is contested. Public perception for the learners is coincident, and for the attachments group it's out of step. Power for the learner group is vicarious. Its relationship with the dominant speaker group, and power is experienced for the attachments group as subaltern, and the intellectual focus on the learners is basically neoliberal, while the intellectual focus on the attachments group is either traditionalist or philological. Now, I haven't done that justice. I've gone through it very quickly. We should probably do another session on this further on. However, given this context now between the portrayal of the learner ideology, learner and minority language ideology, and the attachments crisis, what's occurring to me is a phrase from Frantz Fanon's Les Damnés de la Terre, the wretched of the earth. And this is what occurs to me given the analysis that we've done on the weak societal position of the Gaelic group in Ireland and Scotland. I'll read it out. By the time a century or two of exploitation is past, there comes about a veritable emaciation of the stock of national culture. It becomes a set of automatic habits, some traditions of dress, and a few broken down institutions. Little movement can be discerned in such remnants of culture. There is no real creativity, no overflowing life. This is the product of the desocialized intellect of the Gael, in tandem with the cultural devaluation, the point that Conchúr, the Susa Santos, is making about cultural distance. I want now also, I talked initially about the issue of the Gaelic status system in the early modern period, and I want to hypothesize a contemporary status system for the Gaelic world that I think applies to Ireland and Scotland. This is set out in more detail. I'm going to have to go through it very quickly today. It's set out in more detail in a 2016 publication. Myself and colleague Jane O'Kern on the Dark to Sewer, a new deal for the Gael. And this is how I think we can hypothesize the social ranking system for the Gael in Scotland and Ireland. We have a hierarchical category, 3 groups: a referent class, a professional category, and the social group. And I'm borrowing here from sociology. A referent class, that's the class of people that frame public perceptions, decide policy priorities, devise the policy, set out the context for resource allocation, and they also deal with issues of expectation management among the social recipients of the policy. Moving down, if we look at the second column then, the role of different people in the social ranking system. At the top of the social system, we have cultural and philological scholars, all part of the referent class, creative and aesthetic practitioners, senior media professionals, senior language policy professionals, language policy and language status academics. These basically make up the referent class that emerges out of the existing policy we have. Then the professional category, these are the people that put the policies into operation. They don't necessarily devise policy, but they may have an input. There is some flow between the professional category and the referent class. The professional category then would refer to junior middle ranking professionals, middle ranking language professionals at a national level. For them, language specialist professionals, what I'm referring to here are teachers, translators, publishers, editors, corpus planners, so on and so forth. And then at the bottom of the professional category, we have local language officials. Then we have a break between the professional and the referring class, and we have the social group, then the actual recipients, the social recipients of the policy and those who operationalize it in the professional category. And at the top of the social group, but away from the referring class, we have the non-specialist, the captain's middle class L2 learners, non-professional L2 learners, and then non-professional captains. Well, you asked the question, how does this matter? Well, you see at the bottom of the social ranking system, we have the non-professional autochthones, the native speakers. They are too far down the ranking system. When the needs of those higher up the social ranking system are met, there is very little left in the pot to deal with their requirements. That is why we get what I refer to as this sectoralism based on symbolic civic promotion. Moving on then, looking towards the issue of putting rebalance into effect. And this is set out in chapter 8 and 9 in our book. And what we're calling for now, based on our analysis of the Gaelic situation, is that we have to refocus policy in the islands on the actual speaker group and prioritize the issues of language remote protection. We need the official bodies to, we're calling for official empathy for the threatened group, and we need an agenda of productive and coherent plans that it is capable of engendering participation in a cooperative, in other words, a social approach to the Gaelic crisis. The philosophy of this is one of interdependence, looking at the different groups that can help give life and salience to the actual social use of Gaelic. And to do this, we need to maintain the existing communities of speakers we have, promote and support the emergence of new networks, in other words, socially productive learners of Gaelic and Irish. And this will be done in an overall social context of having a sympathetic political and official intervention that is based on the societal reality of the speakers, not on civic aspiration. So the model we're suggesting is a participatory minority language cooperative. This is a social policy rather than institutional policy for the Gaelic group based on a comprehensive language in society approach. And the main framework to give reality to this participatory minority language cooperative is Uras na Gaelic, or a Gaelic Community Trust. And we set out the governance structure here on this slide. And this is basically a way of developing Gaelic democracy or Gaelic communities where it has resource based on a cooperative mentality, as an executive, as a board and an executive, and it is backed up by research and advisory support. The main aim of this new approach is to give socioeconomic and societal assistance to the group that is threatened and to allocate resource and benefit to the members of the cooperative. I'm going to finish up on this slide, and this indicates the circular dynamic that is required if a minority group is going to survive. Basically, salience has to be protected. That's the communal adherence, that the group adhere around its social use. For this to happen, it requires a formal bespoke structure. It means a strategic intervention and efforts to build comprehensiveness into the policy engagement. And this in turn requires a leadership of rooted progressiveness to give direction to the group, again feeding into vitality. Communal adherence, backed up by support and receiving leadership that helps to give direction and relevance to the group in their actual challenges. Under the current circumstances, in other words, if we do not change, if we stick to the status quo, with existing policies, the Gaelic world is going to descend into a programmed aridity. I think there is a better way of doing this, a more productive way, a more interesting and engaging way, and that is to devise a language in society policy and ask people to support it. I leave it like that. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Conchúr. I'm sure first group to what's happening in Wales, and Wales might be not so far down the path to making Welsh obsolete, but might be on a similar trajectory. So if you could comment on that. One observed that he'd been in a grocery shop in Wales and been asked by a member of staff there if he needed help in Welsh, and the day that stops happening is the day we know that Welsh is also endangered. And there was another question about Welsh too, and observing that it's not just these individual languages that are mentioned, but should maybe be phrased in terms of resisting a bigger Anglophone culture surrounding them both. Did you share some thoughts on the Welsh topic?
I do indeed. The Welsh language, Welsh speaking are not in type of crisis as in the Gaelic world. They have to endure the same naivety and the same emotion, the same way as the Gaelic world Ireland and Scotland. But here in Wales,
and then there's been a few questions asking for what do we do, practical advice. One person observed that the book, The Gaelic Crisis, is written for an academic audience, but how would you translate that over? Or do you have actually any plans of making a version that's more aimed at the general public? And in such a publication, what practical steps would you outline?
okay, that's a very good question. There are 20 pages of recommendations in the final chapter of the book, chapter 9, and we made particular efforts to write the book in a way that crosses over the academic world and the general readership. But on top of that, also we produced a digest, which is available on the website of the Language Sciences Institute. And you can go in there and get the details of the practical steps. For example, there's an integrated plan in the book that forms the basis for the new policy engagement if the communities and the Scottish state and the councils want to go down that road. But basically, we need to give socio-economic advantage to the Gaelic speakers in the areas where they live, and we need to emphasize the familial transmission. We should set up a family support scheme for Gaelic speaking families to encourage them in their efforts. The educational system should be much more proactive, progressive. Essentially, it should be more Gaelic. It should be more rooted in Gaelic culture, and it should give leadership to the communities that are in crisis. Another practical initiative, we should set up youth support groups to help with the socialization of Gaelic among young speakers. As we saw in the book, around 20% of the teenagers in the Western Isles are fluent speakers, but only 1% are speaking among themselves. Well, surely we can come up with devised plans or set up social initiatives that would give them an opportunity to speak among themselves to help to start to build up confidence among them, to be confident members. This issue of adherence. If you don't adhere to a language group, well, the language group cannot survive.
And following up on that, how do we avoid any such support being seen as something that's imposed top down?
Well, you can't impose support like this. It's I wouldn't look at it as negatively like that. I find the debate that has been going on in the islands since the publication of the book has been very encouraging. People want to engage. What has put people off to date is that the policies have been so irrelevant and anemic that the Gaelic group has more or less stayed away from Gaelic officialdom. It's very hard for Gaelic officialdom to attract people to adhere to Gaelic policy unless the Gaelic policy is going to be relevant to their experience of the Gaelic world.
There's been 3 comments here on what one person called the elephant in the room, and that was English and Anglo-American globalization and the general acceptance of Anglo-American culture, not just in relation to Gaelic, but everywhere. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's very difficult to promote a minority language if a dominant culture is going to have free reign in every single societal domain. It's basically impossible. For a language to be transmitted to another generation, the culture has to be transmitted also. To an extent, the young have to be given confidence in the culture and not be exposed to an unfair competitive dynamic from a very, very young age. Sociolinguistically, it's unrealistic.
Okay, question here. Where does the greatest challenge to the perseverance, if not growth, and preservation of Gaelic actually come from? Is it a case of actual opposition or societal indifference or something else altogether? With this in view and in summary and pragmatic form, how should this be addressed, and is there a will to do so?
Again, I go back to this issue I referred to in the talk, that the main difficulty is misdiagnosis. That we assume that civic promotion is going to help a highly endangered group, when civics promotion is essentially naive moral support for a threatened group. What we actually need is social policy, realistic policy that identifies the level of this issue of giving a realistic narrative to the community of their own condition and devising support that targets the actuality, the reality of the speakers. It is the level of unreality in policy, in language policy in Scotland and Ireland, that is basically the problem.
Got a question here about literature as well. Could you say something about the role of Gaelic literature, and specifically would you say that self-translation of Gaelic literature contributes to the symbolic promotion of the Gaelic language?
Well, again, we go back to Bonaventura de Sousa Santos. It's very important that the cultural capital, the cultural resources of the group is valued and protected. Literature is part of the cultural capital. Wouldn't it be much more productive to have writers of Gaelic devise literature in their own language rather than translate existing literature from other languages? I think not to rule that out, but it's more productive and it helps more with this issue of valuing the cultural capital also.
Writing Gaelic from the start, yeah. I've had a couple of questions here about Irish too. One wanted to know about your earlier research in Ireland and if anything is happening on the back of that in Ireland. And another wanted to know what's the difference between the questions on Gaelic language and Irish language in the respective censuses. The census in Scotland more specific than the general questions that are used in Ireland.
Okay. Yes, the census questions in Ireland are much more detailed. We have the same question as in Scotland. Do you have an ability, the Gaelic ability question, but we have a use question. Are you a daily user of Irish? And if you are a daily user, is that daily use related to school use or in community? I'm paraphrasing them in a different way, but that's the information we're looking for. And we know that there is a big gap from the Gaelic ability data and the daily use data in Ireland. So the reason I make that point is that the Gaelic ability data in Scotland, that is really a depiction of as good as it gets. This is why we brought up this issue of the actuality gap. We know in reality that the Gaelic ability data doesn't indicate the social salience, the social use of Gaelic in these communities. That's why we can go from an area where 60% of the residents in one of our study districts, they can indicate that they have an ability in Gaelic, but only around between 1 and 5% of the youth, of the teenagers, are speaking it among themselves. There's quite a large actuality gap there between use and stating that you have an ability.
Did Ireland take your diagnosis on board and act on it?
Well, they brought in a new Gaeltacht Act, and very few of the recommendations of the comprehensive linguistic study and the update of that study in 2015 have been taken on board in official policy. I would say what's happened in Ireland is that the 2012 Gaeltacht Act isn't actually a Gaeltacht Act. It's an act for Irish, mostly focused on learner agendas. So what's going to happen now? The policy in Ireland is ignoring the decline of the speaker communities in the Gaeltacht and is trying to promote the learning of Irish in schools. Essentially, the Gaeltacht Act is going to turn the Irish-speaking areas into areas where we have a higher percentage of learners rather than native-speaking communities of Irish. A type of an unwanted outcome from the policy provision, but the policy provision isn't social or societal enough to deal with the trajectory of decline.
And then I have a question about the Gaelic activists, and you have touched on this already, but the audience member here is saying that Gaelic activities are given enough money to keep Gaelic activists busy, but not enough to make any real difference. What do we need to invest in to change things?
Right. There's this interesting debate in Scotland that people think that a fortune is spent on Gaelic promotion. Everything is comparative, of course. In comparison to Ireland and Wales, language policy takes up a very, very small percentage of governmental and public finances. The issue should not be on activism, but on coherent social policies. We will have activists anyhow, and fair play to them, and they're very courageous. But government bodies have the resources. There is Gaelic policy. There are Gaelic organisations. The question should be, why does Gaelic officialdom not face up to the challenge that is there? And the challenge is that we will have Gaelic promotion and no Gaelic communities, which is a contradiction in terms. The first step is for the official recognition of the level of crisis and for Gaelic officialdom to start facing up to the gaps and irrelevance in existing policy.
One person here is wondering, would there be a point to setting up Gaelic groups abroad in other countries where English is not the first language to study and promote Gaelic abroad?
Well, again, we shouldn't stand in anybody's way if they want to do that. And might be a great benefit to those participating in it, but it's not the same issue as dealing with the vernacular crisis. Another aspect of it, of course. Yes.
Okay, possibly last question. We'll see. The study here investigates Gaelic areas, and the person who asks this has observed that the most successful is to bring about things from the grassroots upwards. Parents and others, and often sometimes fighting against political oppositions. For example, in Ireland, Wales, Brittany, in the Basque country, etc., etc. So what can we learn from each other about grassroots language movement?
Yeah. Well, we know the core issues, the most important, most productive aspects of language policy, and that's a focus on community development, community empowerment, the focus on the family, in other words, intergenerational transmission, a focus on the youth, a focus on socioeconomic advantage for the speaker group, and a focus on education. That education is philosophically rooted in the culture and encourages the young speakers of Irish and Gaelic to be confident speakers of the language, but more importantly, confident participants in a collective culture. What is because of the neoliberal emphasis in current policy, what we have at the minute are Gaelic individuals. If the policy is going to reform itself, put it like that, we need to put more emphasis on the issue of the Gaelic collective, the minority language collective. Basically, you cannot have confident, competent, robust participants of a language unless you have a strong collective of that language to give support and benefit to those who adhere to that.
That's a huge challenge, and it's great that you're saying it in such clear text and pointing it out, because I think that's spot on. Several people in the chat have also pointed to the role of the community and community groups out with school and family, for example, libraries, youth groups, and so on, and that'll all build up under what you're saying there. We have run out of time, and there's still questions and comments in the chat, but I would just like to thank Conchúr and Giollagáin very, very much for this fascinating talk on a very difficult topic, but a very important topic. And huge thanks to everyone who's participated and sent in questions and observations. Anything you would like to say to end on, Conchúr?
Yes, just to thank the the UHI HARC committee members for organising this series, for allowing me to contribute to the series. I'm thinking of Joanna Rogers in particular, all the work she's done and the work you've done, Raggy. And on top of that, I'd like to thank you for chairing the session. You've been able to field the questions in a very efficient manner. And I'd like to thank everybody who's come along today, and especially those who've made comments and asked questions. So thanks for participating. And I feel that this is the start of a broader discussion that will help bring more relevancy to minority language policy.
Thank you very much. We'll continue the conversation.